But it's that extremity that makes him also so hurt and write some of the most sensitive, the most private pieces ever seen in collective movements. So, the map finally that we're dealing with is not Paris, Moscow, but at the same time there is Johannesburg, there is Durban, there is Shanghai, there is Mumbai, there is New York. There's a whole world that's in conversation with itself. You know, Europe did not separate itself from the world. In fact, during those years, it precisely imposed itself on the world through process of colonization. The biggest problem with a lot of the literature that was developed in Paris and Moscow during that time is about the invisibility of the colonial moment. It's all self-absorbed and self-absorbing. Of course, he's got a fantastic poem on colonialism, but he didn't spend much time thinking about it. Nor did Baudelaire, although he practically had to live discrimination. And Rimbaud decided to go and find it. Yeah. So, we can do sociology of the arts. And we can both celebrate it, at the same time map it, understand its dynamics, understand its politics of inclusion and inclusion, and understand that the judgments we make are also about power. I would never deny the fact that there is something that tells us, even our cultural formation, that something is good or not good. We always do that. We like certain, we don't like certain things. But any statement like that is a statement of power, of inclusion and exclusion. It's very important to understand the continuity of things, the contradictions, over and above what aesthetic gatekeepers tell us is real. So, that's it from me for today. We're starting. Comments? Questions? Does it make sense? Somebody say something. You want to say something?
Yeah, no, just been very interested in two figures of the early part of this century, Dubé and what's his name, who wrote the Secular National Anthem. Both were photographers. And very interested in images, but Dubé goes to England, America, carrying photographs to use to raise money, come and civilize the natives, and Christianize them, you know. And it's a very interesting area. Nobody's really looked at that until recently, and the effects of the other and how it becomes internalized by the black intellectuals of that period until there's a break. And it's interesting to see the break with our Mangope, sorry, Mangoba in the 1930s. And it's very fascinating, this travel into the different capitals and its effects on how we develop an aesthetic or reject one. And then you get the black consciousness period, where it turns everything upside down. It's a very interesting way. But yeah, I'm organizing a conference of that in on the 1970s, where hopefully a lot of those issues and the debates around culture will become quite able to explore. I think your point about those four things is very important, because we normally and how sociology and understanding that, especially in the colony, is such an important thing. It's an area that we don't really look at in any real sense. But it's an area that it's an issue of now quite relevant when we say we want to create a new nation, a new set of ideas around, a new set of symbols, reject the old and embrace the new. But where is that center? It's a question that everybody is beginning to now grapple with.
I found the presentation very helpful as well, because in my work as a filmmaker, I've often confronted these aesthetic judgments in very painful ways, both internally in South Africa and elsewhere. And the aesthetic gatekeepers are very, very powerful. So it's very useful to have an overview of and a reminder of what the kind of movements that developed and the thoughts that developed in the late 19th century, early 20th century actually continue to shape the world today. But I've had a few other thoughts and comments as well. And one is that it's quite interesting. First of all, Lenin was very positive about electricity, bringing freedom to the proletariat and the rest of the world. And of course, we know it hasn't happened. It's how you use electricity that determines whether there will be that kind of freedom. But at the same time as Soviet artists were celebrating the machine, Charlie Chaplin was critiquing the machine in a very interesting way. So that's just an interesting idea. And the question that also arises, and I have a lot of answers to it, and I won't start with them now, is that to what extent do the arts of the Russian Revolution actually fail to solve the problems of socialism artistically? To what extent are they merely responding and don't artists also have the role to be present? And to what extent were they present? And to what extent were they merely responding to their circumstances, their very intense circumstances? And of course, those of us who lived through the 80s, we know how that intensity can shape art and make things happen, movements happen, and so on. But the really powerful and interesting artists are those that look at it beyond. And I could talk endlessly on that question, but I won't right now.
Well, thank you. Then, we can spend years talking about, let's say, some of the experiments that happened during that time. The Stites book is very, very important, because it just shows how energies get channeled. That the context of the revolution, the uncertainty, everything that is, because it wasn't just about celebration. It was miserable times. There were food shortages. There were no resources. There was madness at some time. It would have been easier to be in the countryside, growing your own food, than being in a city. And there were wars, and so. But the energy of these currents of artistic production, thinking that they were building their world there. So you would have these street processions, these carnivals being invented, the amazing things, but also the monumental. You begin to see the monumental, they were making designs of towers to be enormous sculptures. And for a short period of time, experimentation was tolerated fully. Then it's turned, and the criticism starts again by using the radical impulse what I call, or Sumangala calls the radical of saying, your art is inaccessible to the people. You're a bourgeois artist disguised as a proletarian, you know. So your art really is not real people's art. Is contaminated. There's impurities about it, and so on. Now, juxtapose then a Stalinist period with this scientism that's only one correct line. And if you don't have the correct line of socialist realism, you're in trouble. And many artists were either killed and sent to the gulags and so on, which creates counter movements, creates counter voices, and distance between decent art and what's going on in the state. So, and that's one of the other things, it's socialist realism then becomes the canon for everybody because of the international communist movement. You know, you're either in socialist realism or you are either a traditionalist or this or that. But we're coming to the ambiguity of Stalin in the next lecture. And so it was, yeah, so it's, but how do we judge? You know, how do we judge which of those artists is profound and is visionary and who not? You know, who argues? You know, I can do it, I can write something. But what I'm asking all of us to think is that in me doing that, I'm beginning to play the game of inclusions and exclusions. So.
No, I would say that what you try to avoid the judgment. I think it's more the question in you as the interpreter. What is the richness of your interpretation? How do you bring something to life in a way that, you know, addresses a whole range of issues that makes it come alive? Whereas someone may just see something as this or that. But you actually, it's the lenses that you bring to it. But I think that it's about making compelling arguments. I don't think it's about passing judgment. I think it's very risky to be passing judgment, to say who's the artist of. I think it's more, what case can you make about a so-called minor artist or a so-called major artist in terms of how you interpret that work and you engage the material?
That's my colleague talking, who's produced the canon on South African art recently, and this excludes all the visual artists and photographers.
No, it doesn't. You can argue about it.
Exclude them.
Sorry, you want to say something?
I wanted to say, isn't that also a way of judging?
You can't get away from that. I mean, what interests you? What do you engage with? What do you see? What do you acknowledge? But I think in the interpretive act of engaging with it, I'm saying something can draw you for a whole range of reasons. It's not necessarily the matter of aesthetic judgment or some kind of notion of what constitutes good and what constitutes bad. I think how alive can you make that material? I mean, I don't know, I'm just nervous when people start talking about good art and bad art, because I mean it's really all a matter of interpretation and validation, and it's that act that's the interesting one.
What's interesting, David Hume in his paper, The Standard of Taste, talks about the necessity for us to have judgment, and he philosophizes about this idea of an ideal critic. And he goes so far as to say that it's important for us to have these ideal critics that we look to pass judgment, and that we should go so far as to aspire to become like them, or to have their taste, because they reflect refined taste. And if all of us had refined taste, we would live happier, more fulfilling lives. So I mean, it's quite an interesting philosophical debate as well about implicit judgments made in these kinds of aesthetic claims, and the roles of these of these critics, and even if it's possible for them to exist. I mean, Hume gives a list of standards. The ideal critic needs to be completely objective. They need to be disinterested. There's a whole list of qualifications, and really it's almost impossible for anybody to even fulfill those. So how do we even determine who has the talent to be such a critic?
Can I ask you for a favor? Can you upload the definitions on Bulla for everyone? There is Immanuel Kant as well. Just a critique of. The question. That's where the idea of the disinterestedness of the aesthetic. It's a desire without venal desire. It's a desire for a certain ideal. That begins to define the purity of gaze. And so there's a lot of philosophical work that was done. And so it's a very important question. Because, okay, I am Mr. Lotto. You apply for projects, you define what your artworks will be or your community work, and I will say yours and yours and yours and not yours. But we'll say that's crude. Huh? That's a crude way. There's the National Arts Council saying your play is getting resources, yours isn't. And who is on the National Arts Council? It's obviously people who are supposed to be there. But why do you get CVs then? In terms of people that you put on boards to evaluate things. So everything is being assessed and evaluated, and so on. And then there are, unfortunately, it was much more vibrant in the 19th century in Paris because there were at least 20 journals and 10 newspapers doing these things and getting, and writing about these things. Whereas here it's monopolized. So you can have one critic, because their arts are marginal, one critic in a newspaper who writes about everything. Otherwise you rely on opinion pieces. There are no reviews happening anymore on performances in the newspapers. You write your own kind of thing and you send it to them and they write that it's going to happen. And it also happened to me. There was a poetry reading in Nairobi where the star enjoyed my performance, and there was I didn't go. So they took the advertisement of what, the blurb there from the Center for Creative Arts that was organizing that, and assumed that the performance happened. It's that bad. I like that with you, I kept it. And it came in. Yeah. So the role of the dominant press is now being imploded by Facebook and social media that creates its own democratic space and chaotic space, but it allows you much more freedom. So, and the thing is that what we need to, when we're going back in time, is just start imagining time without the things we think obvious now. That, for instance, for somebody to be canonized as good, it's word of mouth or a publication that really alerts you to something. And you start imagining, out there in Paris they do that. And then you translate it into what you are doing here without seeing the work, without whatever. So it's the work of the imagination. Now, as you're saying, the new media and film and other things have almost created a surplus of intensity in imagery at the moment, where it's very hard. Speaking to our friend Azad in Doha, imagine over Syria you get 700 visual clips a day coming your way, and you're sitting and looking at and all this misery. And you have to choose now. You have to ignore them all, or choose three, or what story are you telling? There's too much happening. Whereas in the old days you would have a reliable,
What you say makes me think about how the too much is also very skewed in terms of class and race. Because I'm thinking very much here about the Cape Flats. I did a film on music in Cape Town and worked for a number of years with people from the clubs, from Christmas choirs, from jazz musicians and so on. And when we arranged the premiere at Artscape, we went to the people who were in the film and said, we'd like to invite you. And some people said, we don't know where Artscape is. Or do you know the old people? No, we don't know it. Are you expecting us to come and perform? No, we're inviting you as guests to the premiere of the film in which you performed. So even the notion of coming to Cape Town and performing in the main theatre in Cape Town was an inaccessible idea for some of the people who actually keep the whole culture of music alive in the city and are virtually, and the structures, for example, even at this university, or I know recently somebody is working here who's done a PhD on Christmas choirs, at that time was blind to this existence of 20,000 musicians. So those disconnects happen, we can't assume that Facebook is reaching Cape Flats, in every possible way. Maybe young hip-hop artists, yes. So that was for me a very, very big lesson in how communication happens, even in one city. And if I can even add to that, because it may be interesting as well in terms of the mapping, we tried to understand a common music for the city on the assumption that there was a common music in the city. And you go to different groups in the city, and one group would say, and those were the closest speaking people, they would say, everybody in Cape Town knows Ntilo Ntilo. And within the older coloured groups, they would say, everybody in Cape Town knows Rosa. I speak to my young cousin's daughter, and she says, the main music of Cape Town is trance. So those exclusions happen in a very significant way.
Sorry.
I think the international moment where things become hierarchical in terms of who's big and who's marginal emerges after the Second World War. The Second World War created a huge movement of people and artists and things. And the post-war war period created a new audience through the use of radio, TV, and things like that. So there is a moment between before and after where you now get art commodified in a way that becomes dominant all over the world. So what happens in New York becomes more important than what happens in Delhi. So that's also a factor one needs to take into account, because there are 2 or 3 different levels of interaction taking place before the war and after the war. And so you get the work of artists or writers or thinkers, but it takes us a longer period to reach the colonies, unless you are in London. Take Gandhi in London, and you take Tolstoy, and that interaction, and then it comes and plants itself in South Africa. So it's a very interesting phenomena, this issue of the transmission of art, and who controls and how it is.
But also travel was different.
Travel.
Just speaking to somebody who had traveled